Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre. Puerto Rico means rich port, but few on the island are feeling very wealthy these days. Unemployment in the U.S. Commonwealth is nearly 7 points higher than on the mainland. A state of economic emergency declared almost a year ago is still in effect. On this edition of Independent Sources, we examine the economic crisis in Puerto Rico. Will the loss of jobs spur a major migration to the mainland? And we hear about the exchange Afro Latinos are having on the internet about race, color, and ethnicity. We'll have those stories and news of the week after this.
Ethnic media is growing media, and the rest of the media is shrinking because it seems like ethnic media is the part of the media that's doing better and maybe is like the hope for the future.
A state of economic emergency has been in effect in Puerto Rico since last March. Thousands of public sector employees have lost their jobs. Labor unions, political opponents, and religious leaders have responded with protests against the current government. And the impact could soon be felt beyond the island. Judith Escalona filed this backgrounder on the crisis in Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico is called the Island of Enchantment, with its spectacular rainforests and countryside, the charm of its Spanish colonial architecture dating back centuries. However, all that beauty conceals the economic crisis facing its people. This past summer, Governor Luis Fortuño announced more job cuts as he continues his agenda to close government programs and privatize others. 25,000 government employees were given the pink slip, a massive layoff in a country of 4 million that already has a double-digit unemployment rate of 16%. The independent unions and AFL-CIO affiliates reacted with a general strike and the takeover of the government's Office of Management and Budget. Stateside demonstrations also took place outside the Federal Affairs Office of Puerto Rico in Midtown Manhattan. Among those attending, City Councilwoman Melissa Mark-Viverito.
It's a very dire situation. There are hundreds of thousands of people protesting out in the street today to denounce his public policies, including people from his own party. So we're demanding that he turn back his policies right away and to listen to the people of Puerto Rico. There's other ways of dealing with the economic crisis than those that he has presented. And he refuses to sit in good faith with people that have opposing points of view to find alternative solutions. And that's something that we can't accept and we won't stand for.
A teacher and organizer from Puerto Rico, Norma Hiram Pérez, took a broader view of the issue, which extends back even beyond the previous administration, crossing party lines.
El problema del gobierno en contra de los trabajadores no comenzó este año. Llevamos años luchando. Cuando los maestros nos fuimos a la huelga, también estuvimos ahí con ellos. Desde la administración anterior. ¿Ok? Así que esto no es una lucha de hoy contra Fortuño. Esto es una lucha de los trabajadores, de las mujeres trabajadoras y los hombres trabajadores.
Some analysts see a new wave of migrations to the states comparable to the post-World War II exodus known as the Great Migration. But whereas the post-war boom easily absorbed the hundreds of thousands who came mostly to New York, the current U.S. economy has less to offer. I'm Judith Escalona for Independent Sources.
To get an update and some insight into the situation in Puerto Rico, I'm joined via Skype from Sun One by José Laguarta Ramírez. He has written about the economic crisis. Thanks for taking the time out to be with us, José.
Hi, Garry. Thank you for having me.
Give us a sense of why the Fortuño felt that he had to lay off up to 30,000 public workers. What's going on in Puerto Rico?
Okay. As I was saying, that we're going through the same crisis that the rest of the world is going through. In our case, it goes back to 2006. Now, in Puerto Rico, there's been a lot of talk over the past few years about big government and government being overinflated. And there's a certain sector that buys into that ideology, if you want to call it that. So Fortunio thinks, that there's too many people employed by government. The reality of it, though, is that there really isn't, the private sector in Puerto Rico hasn't really been able to create jobs over the past 30 years. So we're talking about 25,000 people laid off, but since 1990, there's been a net loss of jobs in the private sector of about 56,000 jobs.
Now, I understand part of Fortunio's plan is to privatize some government functions. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, what they did is they approved a law. This was right after they took office, called Law 7, which basically what it does is it leaves without effect all collective bargaining contracts in the public sector. It goes over them. It allows the government to go over them. And it allows it to lay off public sector employees without just cause. So that's why they've been able to lay off 25,000 people. Now the plan parallel to that is another law which authorizes what are called public-private alliances, or in Spanish, APPs. The APPs are nothing more than private enterprises, I guess you could call them, private businesses that come in and they take over the functions that formerly these public employees were fulfilling. So now instead of the government doing it, these businesses are doing it. The problem is, and the reason that their plan isn't working, is that there just isn't enough private capital in Puerto Rico to fill in that hole that the government is leaving behind.
Jose, the protests, the unions have been instrumental in organizing people. Now, with the second round of cuts coming, what can they do? What's the union strategy to deal with the situation?
Well, that's a good question, and one that I don't know if a lot of people, even in the union movement, know how to answer. Right now, there's two main big umbrella organizations of the unions and other community groups and churches and so on. And they have not really been able to agree on anything. So that there's a lot of talk, especially in January, when a lot of the layoffs were going to kick in, there was a lot of talk about a general strike. That hasn't really taken off. There's still meetings, there's still talks, there's still people calling for a general strike. Other people are saying, well, maybe we can't pull off a general strike. Let's just do a lot of small-scale protest activities. I think the best chance to stop Law 7 is actually some kind of big strike in the strategic sectors, schools, electric sector, and there's talks towards that. But other than that, there's not much strategizing going on, unfortunately. Okay.
One question about the migration. How realistic is that? And if so, how many people are we talking about migrating to the United States from Puerto Rico?
Migrating to the, well, I can't really give you that number. I know that between 1940 and 1960, we're talking about 50,000 people, I think, migrated. I'm not exactly sure at what rate, but we're, over the past few years, even before Fortunio, we're seeing that happen again. Only instead of New York and Chicago, this time it's Orlando. Okay. So the destinations are different, but we're seeing thousands of Puerto Ricans who are, who are taking off because there are no opportunities here, and it's relatively, easy because we're citizens of the United States to travel to the mainland. So that, with the situation getting worse and worse, we're talking about the tens of thousands, possibly.
Why Florida?
It's close, and possibly the economics of it, the sectors where there are jobs available in Florida possibly have something to do with it. I know that many people see New York as the place where maybe their parents or their grandparents emigrated and didn't have such an easy time at it in the first place. So, Florida is closer, it's warm, and perhaps economically speaking, it's easier for this new wave of Puerto Rican workers who have to leave, our island to sort of integrate themselves into the labor force.
We'll have to leave it there, but we'll continue to watch developments in Puerto Rico very closely. Jose Laguarta Ramírez, thanks for your time.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
Now here's Abi Ishola with some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic media. From New America Media, some lawmakers say the Census Bureau's multi-million-dollar advertising campaign failed to target ethnic communities. $340 million was allocated to the Census Bureau to reach communities to avoid undercounting people in specific areas. Members of Congress who recently gathered on Capitol Hill to discuss the issue said they never saw a budget plan for the communities that got a share of the ad dollars. The Amsterdam News reports that a new city council bill set to crack down on gang initiation activity is too vague. Under the legislation, a person can spend up to a year in jail if convicted of initiating another into a gang and physically injuring that person. The catch? The New York City Police Department and prosecutors don't need a witness or proof that the injury took place during the initiation. President Obama recently welcomed 3 civil rights leaders to the White House to discuss the job crisis among African Americans. BlackPressUSA.com reports that Reverend Al Sharpton, NAACP President Benjamin Jealous, and National Urban League President Mark Morial met with the president for over an hour to come up with a solution to the problem. The leaders described the meeting as candid and open and say they are pleased that Obama is focusing on job creation for 2010. And finally, from the Filipino Reporter, a registered nurse who was accused of a third-degree felony for blowing the whistle on a Filipino doctor has been acquitted. Ann Mitchell reported Dr. Rolando Arafiles to the Texas Medical Board for practicing bad medicine. Mitchell and a fellow nurse will now pursue a civil lawsuit against Arafiles, the county sheriff, and prosecutors claiming those officials retaliated against them for advocating for patients. Those are just a few headlines from the ethnic media. Back to you, Gary.
On independent sources, we've talked before about the black and brown divide between African Americans and Latinos. But what about the color lines drawn among Latinos themselves? Both issues are getting a lot of attention on the internet, especially from young Afro Latinos. Joining me to discuss this topic is Miriam Jiménez-Román of Afro-Latin Forum.org, an organization focusing on black Latinos in the U.S. Also with me is Guesnerth José Perea of Afro-Colombia NY. The group promotes Afro-Colombian culture. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we get into the discussion, let's look at this report by Marlene Peralta about some New York Latinos who are using new technology to talk about race, color, and ethnicity.
Black History Month has sparked a very important discussion among Afro-Latinos. They question why they are almost invisible during this annual celebration. Dr. Marta Moreno Vega says there is a historical connotation to this.
Because there's a miseducation of the African experience in the Americas. I think that for the most part in the United States, it's couched around the African American U.S. experience. But what's left out is that more than 150 million African descendants live in the Caribbean, in Central America, and in Latin America.
It's these descendants and U.S.-born Afro-Latinos who are raising awareness of the divide that exists between dark-skinned Latinos who do claim their African roots and those with lighter skin complexion who don't.
I see it in my classrooms all the time. You know, an African-American young person born here will look at a Dominican and say, but you're as black as I am. What's your problem, you know? And you'll see a Dominican and a Puerto Rican going at it, no, porque yo soy más claro que tú, que el pelo bueno, que el pelo malo, looking at hair texture and so on. So there's conversations happening that were not happening previously.
This discussion about the discrimination that exists in the community and the constant questions about their African roots was what motivated 2 Latino New Yorkers to produce the documentary series Afro-Latinos, The Untaught Story.
Give Afro-Latinos a voice, unravel the truth, and teach the stories never taught to us.
The title came from that sense that the story was never taught to us. It wasn't told to us. You know, as Latinos, as Dominicans, Colombians, Cubans, we're taught one side of a story, which is that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, he came to Latin America and saved us.
You do see the segregation, the separation, los Afro-Latinos aquí, los indígenas there, and of course the big cities with the white Latinos, with the money. So I never understood that, you know, coming from New York, we're all the same, you know, we're pretty much, you know, I would say equal. Of course, this is racial discrimination everywhere, But at least here there's rights. If somebody discriminates you, you can fight for your rights. Well, in Latin America, no. If somebody discriminates you, where are you going to go?
Local educator Bianca Laureano is also promoting the discussion about Latinos' Black identity through her blog called Latinegros.
During Black History Month, we often notice that our narratives aren't a part of that conversation. And so we kind of wanted to add to whatever commemoration, whatever representation was going on around Black History Month, and to say, you know, we are a part of history.
A history that she hopes will continue to be written, not just on her blog.
You know, this is something that needs to be implemented into curriculum year-round, not just for 1 month. How can we make this for someone who, you know, says to us, I never knew Gwen Ifill was Panamanian. Tell me more about that.
While Laureano's focus has been more local, Devia and Santos have traveled all over Latin America to find answers to questions such as why many Latinos don't embrace their African ancestry as Black Americans do.
African Americans have that history solid. You know, they can actually pick up a book and read about Martin Luther King, and their parents could tell them about Malcolm X. In Latin America, who are you going to talk about?
It was really about unifying African Americans and Afro-Latinos here in the U.S. You know, so we understand that we share a story that you may not be aware of. I mean, it's an identity thing, so we're very aware of the pelo bueno, pelo malo, good hair, bad hair. You know, Chris Rock just did a documentary. That's a subject that's very, very powerful and not just affecting the African American community.
Dr. Moreno Vega partly attributes the efforts being made by U.S.-born Afro-Latinos like Devia, Santos, and Laureano to the diversity they have been exposed to in New York City.
These issues are coming forward because we're all in the same place. We're all finding ourselves and having to confront our historical miseducation as well as forging forward with a new reality. And no question that there's another opportunity, given that we have a president that's African descendant. So the future looks bright, but it's still a long way to go.
This is Marlene Peralta for Independent Sources.
Miriam, let's start with you. Do you think there's a black and brown divide among Latinos in this country?
Well, no. That's the short answer.
Okay. Well, well let's move on to Guesnerth.
I think no. I think a large part of the problem is that you're assuming that these two communities are homogeneous. I'm assuming that when you say black, you're talking about African Americans.
No, we're talking about Hispanics.
You said a
Latinos,
black and brown. You said a black and brown divide.
I stand corrected. Right. I stand corrected. Among Latinos.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And actually, it's a divide that also exists within the African American community. It's an issue of color. We, both communities, or all the communities of the African diaspora, suffer from a pigmentocracy or colorism, or whatever term you want to use, that refers to a preference for lightness, preference for certain types of features, including hair, nose, all the rest of these things. We're all equally colonized in that sense. And within the Latino community, that probably is more apparent because we have not had a visible history of resistance. Not that the resistance hasn't taken place, but it's not well documented, it's not well known, as Alicia was saying in this short film, that this is information that's not generally known. And so yes, we have many people who historically have contributed and who were of African descent, but those are not histories, or those are not stories that are told.
Yes, one of the points that I wanted to pick up from the segment we just watched is the notion that when you're black in Latin America, you discriminate against, there's no recourse, there's no equal opportunity in office to deal with it. Is that the case?
It's very much true. For the case that we study with Afro-Colombian New York, Colombia specifically, that happens all the time, where even today a black woman would go to a nightclub in Cartagena and not be allowed in. Then who does she go to tell them they didn't let me in? Usually it takes a long time for that process to go. It usually goes quickly up to some office that tries to dismiss it. So it is tough. Colombia right now is suffering from a lot of displacement by Afro-Colombian communities, and it's very tough sometimes to tell those people, you know, to tell someone, hey, someone's taking my land away, and that does happen all the time, and it is very tough to sometimes get your voice out and get your voice heard and fight for the equality of rights that some other people take for granted. It does happen in the case, at least in Colombia, and I'm sure it's similar in other Latin American countries.
I mean, a lot of the movement and Afro-Latino identity is happening in New York. Why is that?
Well, New York has a larger Caribbean population than other cities in the United States, specifically Puerto Ricans, who actually arrive in this country during a period. It was the prior to the civil rights movement. So this is a community that grew up under Jim Crow segregation, as known in the North, because Jim Crow also existed in the North. And so Puerto Rican, those older Puerto Ricans, I'm talking about the ones who came in prior to 1960, for example, 65, when you get the legislation, the anti-discriminatory legislation implemented, have a different perspective on race. Their place in the racial spectrum was very clearly defined, and that's shifted over the past 40 years or so, and that has created differences. But overall, there are more people of African descent who have a Latino culture, a Latin American culture, in New York than anywhere else.
In Latin America, I'm interested to find out which country is more receptive of its African heritage and what is being done.
I would say none is really receptive.
I was gonna say it's very tough to see one that's receptive of its African ancestry. There are a lot more that are more representative because they're Brazil, for a case.
Exactly, you have a whole state. Bahia is predominantly Afro.
But it can't be ignored in Brazil because there are so many Afro descendants in Brazil that as much as you try to mask it, you can't mask it. The same thing's happening in Colombia. In Colombia, the black population in Colombia is about 30% of the population in Colombia, if not more. And so it could be more. We think it's somewhere about 35, 40%. If that's the case, you can't ignore it. So you're ultimately going to run into having to speak about the darker people who live in this country. But, I always say, at least in the case of Colombia, and I know Professor Miriam would agree, in Colombia, Simón Bolívar wanted to create a mestizo country. That's what he called it. He succeeded because usually people don't realize that there's an indigenous and a black side to it. Usually people just focus on the one thing. So receptive, it's a very difficult thing. I think that there are a lot of countries that are doing a lot to get information out and to get awareness out.
I think we need to clarify, when we're talking about countries, these, for the most part, are grassroots organizations. Yes, they are not institutionalized. They actually are pressuring the government to implement a series of measures that would protect people of African descent, but they are not part of the state.
Are the Caribbean countries like Cuba, Dominican Republic, more open? I mean, Dominican Republic has one of the highest number of Afro-Latinos.
No, they're not open at all. Quite the contrary. There's a saying that those places that have a lot of indigenous peoples will emphasize their African ancestry, and those that have a lot of blacks will emphasize their indigenous ancestry. And that's the case with Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico increasingly, is an emphasis on the Taino and indigenous. It's not even a phenotype. They're actually talking about an indigenous background that overrules any other elements of one's identity.
How much influence or how much have the blacks in Latin America been inspired by what's happening in the United States? Oh, very much so. In Colombia specifically, you find traces of people connecting and seeing the civil rights movement and being inspired by that. So one of the results that some people don't know about the civil rights movement is that it opened the immigration into the U.S. Right. And that helped a lot of people of color in Latin America. And in Colombia, you see writings and you see people who took Martin Luther King's message, you took Malcolm X's messages, and the other civil rights leaders were inspired. And so that's still the case, where they are inspired by what happens here in the U.S.
Yeah. Well, let me just add one again. Remember, we took a trip to Ecuador, and we were specifically visiting Afro-Ecuadorian communities while we were there. And one of the most prominent leaders in that movement in Ecuador, as I walked into his office, there was a poster of Malcolm and a poster of Bob Marley. And those are his two heroes. Okay. Very clearly. He's very conscious of African-American history. Very aware. His daughter is now going to go to school in a historically black college in the United States.
Is there, to some extent, a sense of, if you want, a self-hatred among Afro-Latinos because they feel that they are disenfranchised, so they don't identify with their Afro background? I mean, how about that? Some of them shine away?
I don't know if it's a systematic denial and teaching of deny your blackness. Going back to the question that you asked earlier, I always raise the issue when we do events here for Afro-Colombian New York that calling someone mulatto, prieto, all these different names that we have for people of color has ultimately created a different identity. So someone who's lighter skinned as me sometimes, or someone who's darker skinned sometimes, pero tú no eres negro, you're not black.
Okay.
Why am I not black? Because I just happen to be a shade whiter than you, so therefore now I'm moreno, I'm mulatto, I'm prieto. So that has happened, and so I think that ultimately plays into a psyche and into a mentality and into an ideology, and then people start denying blackness because now they represent mulatto. I'm not black, I'm mulatto. And then mulatto takes on its own being of something separate than black. Meanwhile, it is black. That happens all the time, I'm sure.
Well, I think one of the larger differences is an insistence among Latinos in our racial mixture, as though no one else is racially mixed.
So like Obama.
Excuse me?
Almost like Obama.
Well, actually, it plays
Tiger
into that
Woods.
same type of thing, exactly. So, but the absurdity is that there are no peoples in the world that are not racially mixed. It's what you look like ultimately that determines where you're going to fall on that hierarchy and what kind of treatment you're going to receive. And so more recently, the Afro-Latino Forum has launched a campaign around the census, for example, to try to get Latinos to identify not as they would like to, the terminology individually that they would like to be known as, but as an expression of their social reality. So if you are socially being treated as a black person, acknowledge it, embrace it, and see if in the census at least you can be counted as someone who is not a mixed, but a black person dealing in the world as a black person.
Speaking of the census, how are they categorizing Latinos?
The census form this year has 10 questions, 2 of which apply specifically to ethnic and racial identity. The question number 8 tries to identify who is Hispanic or Latino. They use both terms. And then question number 9 is supposed to be a racial identification. The problem with question number 9 is that it in fact includes ethnic groups in the racial question. And this is really why we decided to launch the campaign, so that people wouldn't be confused. You can be Latino and be black. Black does not only refer to African Americans, you can be both, and in fact, many of us are.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Miriam Jiménez-Román and Guesnerth José Perea, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
We'll be right back.
You promised me the world. Is this what you had in mind?
Help EarthShare and its members restore balance to the world. Visit earthshare.org and see what you can do. EarthShare, one environment, one simple way to care for it.
That's our show. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next week. In the meantime, be independent-minded.